Okay, I think we're ready to get started. So thank you for joining today. The title of the session is Top 5 Disruptive Manufacturing Trends in 2021. My name is Jen Diamond. I'm a product marketing manager here at Tulip. And today I'm joined by Trond. So Trond is a futurist, podcaster, venture partner, and ecosystem evangelist here at Tulip. And he's also the co-founder of Yegi. He holds a PhD in the future of work and artificial intelligence and cognition. Trond is a four-time author, serial entrepreneur, and hosts two podcasts, one called Futurize and a new one called Augmented, which we'll be covering later in the session, which is a new manufacturing podcast presented it will be launching very shortly. He also has an upcoming book called Future Tech, How to Capture Value from Disruptive Industry Trends, which will be released later in March. And he is based here in Massachusetts. So I'm going to hand it off to Trond, who will be conducting the rest of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Jen. We have just 5 very short, interesting trends that we've been observing that we wanted to share with you today. And we're also very, very interested in your feedback because, trends is something you might have seen, at a macro level, or we see it from the perspective of Tulip, but we're curious to see how it translates to you in your everyday professional realities, either on the shop floor or wherever you are. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into each of them. Let's start with the rise of the industrial frontline worker. As we all have experienced last year, which was an interesting year, the frontline worker concept kind of came into play in an interesting way. Obviously, we have always had frontline workers. They have, however, not always been at the front lines of people's attention. And certainly on the industry side of things, they were just, just not in the limelight, but immediately became so as, people started working from home. And now, of course, in the manufacturing industry, that was not typical. So even fairly advanced factories had to change overnight. And I was just listening in on the Davos Agenda Week this week, where the World Economic Forum, which, by the way, also themselves for the first time have gone virtual. But anyway, leaders of massive companies were talking about this, how, in the best case, or at least that's how they're presenting it, they were able to go online over a weekend. Now, is that really possible and realistic for everyone? If you're an SME, small, medium-sized business, who haven't digitized, is it really possible? So the frontline worker really bears the grunt of these changes. And I think a lot of these shifts have to do, obviously, with the fact that when you need to limit face-to-face time in the factory or wherever the production is happening, or even just watching your supply chain, this has a number of challenges associated with it. And we think specifically that this has led or did lead in 2020 to a massive emphasis on training. And for those that didn't, I think that presented an immediate challenge. For those that already had a very trained workforce, I think that presented, again, an enormous advantage. Can I have the next slide, Jen? So what does it take, or what did it take to support the frontline worker over this very tumultuous year? Things that we saw, from the perspective of Tulip, but also from the industry-wide conversations that we're having, is that much more detailed work instructions are just fundamental. And also documenting the work process. What exactly is happening, and how can you document that in a way that you can reproduce it? Because one of the big challenges is, of course, that a traditional frontline worker really was historically depending on their managers and others or their peers to kind of ask advice and things like that. And then suddenly, when a lot of that support either wasn't there or had to be delivered online or through the phone or whatever means, the visibility and the tracking of things just had to increase. Otherwise, things, I think have slowed down. So things like remote engineering support became much more important. And also, as I think we are deeply focused on at Tulip, both for our product and just looking at the industry as a whole, upskilling and reskilling of the frontline worker. And that's actually one of the reasons. I mean, I recently joined Tulip, and one of the things that excites me so much about this new phase that manufacturing is going into is precisely that there actually now are easier ways for the frontline worker to get empowered and have a more exciting work situation, which is something we're going to go into in a second. And I find that actually truly fascinating, and it's going to be a mind shift, and it represents a kind of a 30-year wave, and a shift in, because for 30 years we have been improving IT systems for the white collar workers. We've been trying to improve, the work at home situation and remote work for, people who are not frontline workers. And that has been a very slow process, but luckily we have almost completed that move, because for anybody who's not a frontline worker, last year actually was not so stressful. Can you imagine if the pandemic had occurred even just a decade earlier? We would have had much more massive chaos in the world. And the reason is, the IT system that we have built out, and the training and the usability of those systems for, kind of the white collar knowledge worker. And now this is happening for the frontline worker. As we look into 2021, I think what we're sensing is that the connected worker, meaning sort of digitally connected to the work process, connected to their peers, their managers, but also sort of connected to the work process with fairly immediate work instructions, and really everybody kind of knowing what their role is and having very immediate access to advice on things that might occur during the workday, is not only happening, but it's going to still be a competitive advantage for anybody, small or large company. And the two impacts of that is going to be on the productivity side and on the general sort of agility time. As I said earlier, empowering frontline workers is just extremely important. And when we do, and we have a little poll here, we're sort of curious, have you seen this focus on either agility or productivity? And which one of them do you think is going to be the most focused on in the coming year? Is it sort of straight up productivity, or is it a more broader, sort of wider focus on being agile? So let's see if you can vote. So I wish I could hear and see you. It's one of the frustrating things of this COVID online world here. We can't always get all the immediate feedback, but I know you have the chat function and Jen's monitoring, so you can ask a question at any point, and feel free, if you don't know how to vote during this, let Jen know in the chat as well. Jen, can we move forward? Do we have some votes here? There we go. So there is a sense in the audience that even agility, so I guess a bit more of an advanced, broader focus is going to be quite important in the year ahead. That's great. Can you close that poll, Jen? Thanks so much to all of you listening for giving me a tiny bit of a feedback of what you're thinking out there, because that's much more important than my little musings. Now, trend number two that we wanted to focus on today is the digital aspect. So shifting from digitizing, like I said earlier, a traditional knowledge worker, and then now, perhaps for the next decade or more, really trying to transform the industrial worker. It's actually shocking that it's taken us so long to even start worrying about this, because study after study of the factory floor and in manufacturing, or indeed really in any use of technology, shows that the failures aren't that the robots are not working themselves. Like technology, of course, does fail, but mostly it fails, or when it fails, it's extremely important that we as human workers know how to fix it, or indeed don't really cause these problems. So human error, procedures that weren't understood, obviously equipment failure is a problem, but if it can be fixed or remedied by simply, switching a button, switching out a part, even having the right spare part, or knowing who knows how to install it. Many of these are very, very human-centric processes. They don't really have to do with the technology, or if they have to do with the technology, it's a combination of the people and the technology. You cannot blame a large percent of these failures on the shop floor on technology. And so again, the training deficiencies and the problems related to not having a trained manager on site is just extremely important to remedy. All of this leads to this notion that we think there will be a massive empowering of the frontline worker. Now, this is exciting in a couple of ways. First off, just adopting digitalization, I think, is beneficial both for the meaning of the work itself, and it will lead to less errors, which obviously is stimulating if you are one of those workers. It is, of course, very exciting if you are manager of the process, or you're running the books. But also the idea of the worker having some sort of control over their work situation has also been termed almost like a democratization of the work situation. Gartner, a few years ago, formulated this term citizen developer. And it's sort of, I find it a little bit of a weird term, but I will say this. The gist of it is very, very important, because when you, as a developer, and in fact, not just developers, but literally, hopefully, anybody on the shop floor is now able to have a much larger voice in not only what their work looks like, but they can sort of change and have an impact on business processes, and they can build, smaller apps and sort of efficiency tools that are either sanctioned by corporate IT, or they don't really enter into the picture at all. And this is a completely new picture. And, Tulip is part of this revolution. And I'm sure many of you are on this seminar today because you are actually exploring these tools. You have been building maybe Tulip apps, or you have been exposed to them. But this is happening beyond Tulip. Citizen development is just a very powerful way that a work process is going to change from the bottom up, as opposed to just be mandated either from the top or sort of managed, and typical these long sort of corporate IT projects that tend to be pretty expensive. So that's a good thing. Jen, can I get the next slide? So we're curious, do you see any of this notion of a bottom-up process in your organization, visible in apps, visible in some sort of input? Do you see that being implemented in the coming year? I'm pretty curious about that. We definitely hope so, because Tulip's software is a so-called no-code platform, where the revolutionary thing there is that a lot of people who are not software developers, you just couldn't engage, even in the quality movement, right? And I know a lot of you are quality managers. Even these sort of business processes, they always tied in with IT. Okay, this is pretty interesting. A good majority of you, 67%, are actually thinking that this is going to start to happen in 2021. That's a big number. But also 33% are not seeing it happen. And I'm not extremely surprised, because, just because Gartner thinks it's a trend and there are some startups and maybe some larger companies starting to implement these principles, it doesn't mean the industry changes overnight. And you can see this even at the World Economic Forum level. This week, in Davos, where they're discussing all these things. Big companies want to present that this is has been an easy year, and 2021 they have everything under control. But it is a slow moving industry, and even if this starts to happen, it's not going to happen overnight. So I think both sides of the coin are true here. Things will change and are changing in manufacturing, but those of you who are quality managers, how complicated these changes are. This is not just software, because we are living in a very physical infrastructure. All right. Let's see if we can move on to 3. All right, so let's look at the third part. One of the things that we've been covering is the fact that this is not all about kind of simple automation. And simple automation, way before robotics, right? It was just, things, all kinds of factory technology that was there, in the first and second, and now kind of in the third and fourth, whatever number we are in the Industrial Revolution. Simple automation has always gotten a bad rap. And I think there are reasons for it. And there's even been sociologists speaking about alienation, and maybe some of you have workers who have felt this way, or maybe yourselves earlier in your career. I certainly have had many of these fairly manual jobs where you don't really see the meaning of what you're doing. I remember in my military service, at some point I was like sending out thousands of letters, and I was just basically literally licking stamps. And some of that process, was automated, but you were just a tiny little part of that automation. And whether the machine was doing the job or you were just inputting to the machine, these kinds of very semi-automated processes where you cannot change what's happening, this very first generation automation, or advanced automation with robots, but with the aim of completely replacing a human. That's maybe what we don't consider, I think, these days. In 2021, we're hoping to see a lot more augmentation. So with robots, that would mean cobots, meaning robots that are not dangerous, robots that are capable of interacting with humans, that are legally allowed to be with humans, because many industrial robots, as you know, have to be fenced in because they're dangerous, right? They don't have the control systems, the AI and sensors required to know whether there are humans in the way, and they will basically be dangerous. So augmentation has a lot to do with safety, but it also has a lot to do with communication and being comfortable working alongside machines as well, which actually, when it really works out, we think this trend is going to be a powerful trend, which isn't just going to go through 2021. It's going to take largely this decade to pan out. But if we do this right as an industry, the augmented worker is going to be a empowered group of people that are obviously much more efficient, but they're also going to be able to, even though you in your factories may need to start small, it allows both leaders and individual workers to start thinking bigger, and it leads to a much more flexible work situation. So I'm curious, have you seen any kind of shifts either in your industry or just around you lately towards more of a focus on augmentation as opposed to sort of simple automation, whether it is kind of more traditional machinery or even into robotics, but augmentation in this case refers to kind of more like a collaborative situation, or where there's an overlay of technology that aims to improve the way that the frontline worker operates, but without taking away any of the essential functions, and literally using the technology to improve. Comment here related to more high variance, low volume work. Right. that's a good point there. Certainly in the beginning, right? I think many of these augmentation efforts, and we see now that you're saying around 73% have seen this shift towards augmentation, and 27. So it's a larger group of you than we're seeing kind of the shift towards citizen developer. That's cool. Very good. All right, so that was augmentation. Let's run over to 4. So trend number 4, here we are thinking more of the supply chain, and the idea, in traditional lean operations, there was this complete concept of saying, supply chains, we need to optimize them, we need to have zero duplication, we need to just, make sure that it's as lean and efficient as possible. And clearly, supply chains have globalized quite to an extreme degree over the last decade. Last year, that obviously became a problem around healthcare supply chains specifically because of lockdowns and other things and shortages and also national mandates and things that fairly shockingly actually impacted business because nation states started to claim that they had a bigger right, to goods that were produced, even though there were contracts saying otherwise. Either way, the push here last year and definitely going into 2021 seems to become one of reshoring. Reshoring because now you have at least a little bit of a political control over what happens to the supply chain. There are, of course, still possibilities of regional lockdowns, so you can't completely control it unless you literally produce it yourself. On the health side, but also I think in other industries, the stricter compliance, both self-imposed by a business and by various government authorities, is going to be something we really have to take into account. Now, clearly in the pharma sector, this has always been the case, but I think increasingly, if you are involved in sort of the healthcare effort overall, a lot of manufacturing is going to be subject to this kind of compliance. So the question then becomes, does this mean that what we meant by lean manufacturing in the supply chain, that we're moving into a different type of concept? And clearly there have been people arguing that we are in a post-lean environment or a digital lean environment, which changes a lot of the fundamental ways that we thought about supply chains anyway. Regardless what your view is on, where the manufacturing industry is or should be heading, there's no question that, these incrementally improving your supply chain, not just by making them leaner, but actually by following these sort of two things, like reshoring some of it in order to regain some control, but mostly duplicating and increasing the transparency of the supply chains. These are things we're, I think, seeing across the industry. Now, will they last? Let's say stability sort of returns somehow in 2021. It's a possibility that we would go back to this fairly globalized supply chain again, but then only if we had guarantees, that this kind of lockdown wouldn't happen again. Would I be so kind to distinguish between duplicating and reshoring? Yeah, well, by duplicating supply chains, I meant something as simple by saying, you just having two suppliers of an essential product that perhaps blocks you in your work process, right? So if you have a product or even a spare part or something that comes from one supplier in Asia, that's not necessarily a great idea. It was never a problem because, postage being what it is, it could perhaps arrive in 5 days in the old environment. That just cannot be counted on in 2021. Vaccines or not, we are not going into a very reliable environment in 2021. And the difference from 2020 is that now we know. So there's no excuse anymore. If you don't duplicate supply chain or individual pieces of your supply chain, I don't think, if you have a massive global supply chain with like hundreds of suppliers, I don't think anyone's saying that you need 5 of each of these suppliers if you previously were okay with one. But I think each and every one of us would benefit from rethinking who we are trusting to supply us, necessary elements of our own products. So now I'm curious, how and where was your own supply chain challenge during COVID-19? Was it more on the global side? Was it on the compliance side? Did you have to add inventory on site, or did you can enter into chat any kind of experiences you had with supply chain disruption? Joseph says diversification of stateside suppliers. Yeah, so I don't know if you're saying that that's a good thing, or you're saying that that's more important than global diversification. Let's see. Well, the group seems to say that the global supply chain has definitely been challenged. So many of you must have been relying on foreign suppliers. Some of you, 13%, have seen something on compliance, and then extra inventory, 38% are pointing that out. And then there's some other topics in the chat, which I'm sure we'll get to. Well, thank you. Thanks again. It's just so stimulating that you answer these poll questions, so we get a little bit of interactivity into this. Now, so we're on trend 5, last trend. Here we just wanted to flag the distributed aspect. So we were already talking, of supply chains that are perhaps national, and the sort of renewed importance of having manufacturing closer to home. This is a trend that's been going on for a long time. On the speed side, clearly 3D printing is one of the more obvious and kind of famous things here, that if done well, these would clearly distribute production. Given that you know what to do with the 3D printer and that you have plans for it, because there are also many 3D printers that were purchased and you just don't know exactly how to integrate them in your process. It doesn't help anyone. This is no news to people, I'm sure, in this seminar, because any technology that's purchased without a clear idea of how you're going to use it, is not going to help you. Fab Labs, I think many of you know of these sort of community structures where you can get advice, but you can also get access to infrastructure and equipment that may be not so available in a local context, or maybe you just don't use it that much. So it makes sense to go into a more collective environment and tap into it sort of part-time, and also get connections with a peer group that are exploring advanced technologies for manufacturing. All of that can increase the speed. Now, Tulip, for instance, has also, we also rely on some contract manufacturing, and we have had good we have had good experience with using our own and specifying very detailed in a very detailed way, using our own software, so that we can make sure that when we are not producing everything, because we clearly are not, that we're rethinking that step as well, and also digitizing the communication with our contract manufacturers. So especially in an environment where you don't control all the factors, and you may not be able to visit factories that you rely on as often as you did before, making sure that communication is as clear as possible will give you an advantage. And we think we'll see that throughout the year. On the agility side, I think here we just wanted to highlight a couple of things around the workforce. There are now many organizations, many large companies are slowly starting to think of their own workforce, not just in terms of the people they have on their payroll, which clearly is, you know, historically we're the only ones considered their workforce, but because freelancers just have gotten so much more numerous, so much more important, so much easier to engage with, increasingly, if you are in HR or you are on the strategic side of a company, you sort of have to think of your freelance workforce as your own, in the sense that they are taking such large chunks of your work process that you almost have to think of them as your internal resource. Similarly, you know, to hammer this point on, technology alone, if it is too complicated, isn't the solution. So manufacturing execution systems historically are fairly complicated. At Tulip, we happen to, be part of this movement, as you know, towards more low code or even no code apps, where the idea is you can increase agility because more of the workforce are able to influence their own situation. They are actually able to create apps that improve their own work process. And, that just historically has been very difficult with larger systems that have to be run by a kind of a corporate IT department. So that, again, I think as that starts to influence workplaces will become more important. I was asked to rethink, what was this point about contract manufacturing? I think what we're saying is, if you were relying on contract manufacturers to sort of like understand what you meant by verbal work instructions, or perhaps historically by just traveling to that factory and instructing them yourselves, and if there was some sort of problem, again, kind of picking up the phone and trying to explain it, in a situation where you have less possibility yourself, or maybe at least you can't send your entire team down there to specify what's being what's going to be done, it's even more important to specify more clearly, and in the case of Tulip's apps, to basically have the work instructions available in a digital format, so that these contract manufacturers can operate as autonomously and competently as your own workers would have done. And I think that's the point here, which sort of translates onto this agility point, that whether you're dealing with contractors, you're dealing with freelancers, or you're indeed dealing with anybody who does not have 20 years experience in your company, it shouldn't matter. And indeed, it cannot matter. 2021 is not a year where you can kind of give people extra accolades for having worked for your company for 20 years. If you're producing a product, everybody who is involved in producing that product has to be viewed as equally important to you, because otherwise you will have disruption. So I think that's what I meant by taking contract manufacturing seriously, and that's what we mean by taking the freelance workforce and really any sort of adjacencies, take them equally seriously as if they were within your own organizational control. And lastly, it's not just about localizing production and distributing it out. It's also about not taking chances and producing in smaller batches. So all of these kinds of approaches together, we think, is what's going to increase agility in 2021. So let's see. How do we summarize this? Let's see what you think. What is already part of your own strategy? Have you seen any of these things starting to happen in your own quality procedures? Are you using 3D printers? Have you connected with a local fab lab close to you? Are you doing local production? Are you deploying freelancers? And what about this last trend of empowering frontline workers? Do you see this? I mean, I'm open to the potential that empowering frontline workers is more of an aspirational future situation. I don't think overnight that workers who are kind of embattled, as they rightfully were in 2020, they're not going to immediately start feeling empowered in 2021. So don't misunderstand us. I don't think I'm saying that, you know, the frontline worker is immediately going to, feel emancipated and extremely happy and, matching the CEO in work happiness. But I do think it's interesting what's happening. It seems like all of you have taken that message. 100% of the respondents here seem to say that empowering frontline workers is 100%, part of your strategy. Other things, capturing expert knowledge digitally, 67% say that's important. Freelance workforce, somewhat important. And then local just-in-time production, which I guess is a big part of lean, is slightly less important in this context to you. And then in this question, I guess not a lot of you were talking about 3D printing. Okay. So where does this leave us? I've talked about 5 different things that I feel we should watch out for in 2021. The first was the frontline worker and the importance of it. And it seems like you're validating that concern. So there's probably no news here, but it's not the news I think that's important. It's how do you do it in practice? And do you have a strategy to make sure not only that these workers feel like they are being prioritized, but are you de facto improving the way that they work for their own benefit and for the benefit of your company? Number 2, the trend of actually de-emphasizing creating IT for managers and actually starting to digitize really the shop floor. We think that's going to be a trend not just in 2021, but that hopefully is a lasting trend throughout this decade, so we can really transform the very basis and the basic technologies that are, out there in manufacturing, which admittedly, because they weren't prioritized, they were underinvested, and, manufacturing firms have not been leading in R&D, but maybe they will. Maybe they will now, because there's incentive, there is government will, there's, great need. And I think we have, over the last year, we've seen the benefits. 3, we talked about reversing some of the negatives of automation, specifically, and I haven't focused so much on this here, but there's no doubt that automation does have an impact on individual workers. But when you do it right, good automation is more about augmentation than really just automating and making workers superfluous, at least when it works well. 4, on this supply chain point, I think supply chains are something, it used to be just a business function. You either, you have a supply chain manager. In manufacturing, supply chains have always been important. The new thing, I think, to sort of end off that point, is that I think a great many more business leaders started to realize how much their business depends on a working supply chain. I mean, even families, right? We started hoarding toilet paper and what it is, as if we were going to have shortages. So this notion of supply chain suddenly became a concern in individual families. So that shows you to what extent this has been a concern, and I think will be a concern throughout the next year. Lastly, distributed manufacturing and micro batching of manufacturing is a mega trend, which we are seeing overall, but certainly the pandemic has accelerated both the potential and the necessity of distributing your work process. So that's about what we had for the trends. Jen, do you want to take over from here?
Sure. So before we jump to questions, and if you do have any questions, please put them into the either the chat or there's a Q&A window as well at the bottom of your screen that you can open and put your questions in there. But before we jump into the Q&A, I just wanted to touch on some events that are coming up. So we have another webinar scheduled for February 11th. We'll be talking about GXP environments and MES versus manufacturing app platforms and what are kind of some of the considerations that you should be evaluating, and just answering some questions about both approaches. And then we also have a really big, exciting event on February 25th called The Rise of the Citizen Developer, which will talk about, I think something that's also a question here is how Tulip can help address citizen development and what we have to offer. And that will include a lot of speakers from companies that use Tulip, kind of touching on like, why system development is important for them in meeting their goals, and then also like how they implemented it as well. So I think it'll be a really interesting session. It's about a 4-hour event. So please look for that after the webinar. So that's coming up. And then I wanted to hand it back over to Trond to cover the new podcast that's coming out.
Yes. First, well, maybe we can go to the questions. I know that one question was asked already. The question was, how can Tulip help? And I think these two seminars and conferences are going to be the first answer to that. Tulip is a very open and it's a company all about learning. So if you want to learn and figure out how Tulip can help, we have something called Tulip University. It's a training solution that kind of follows, I think, you can start looking at some of these courses. Some of them are even free. The idea is we understand it's a journey, right? So that's one thing. You can attend these events. You can go on Tulip University, which is an online offering with lots of different things where you can engage and discover for yourself. Because I think the new thing, and hopefully the message of these 5 trends, which I think gel pretty well with what Tulip is trying to achieve, is that it's not like one company is trying to sell you essentially just their product. You have the opportunity with these new trends to take charge much more of your own learning process, and you can kind of decide for yourself and plug and play and mix and match. And that goes for some of the suite that we are presenting, and it goes for some of these more lighter touch apps-based solutions now that are popping up in manufacturing. Now, in order to think about this, we have a podcast as well, which is launching, imminently, called Augmented. I wish we could have given you the URL, but it's sort of struggling a little bit with that at the moment. This is just being launched. But if you are interested in interviews with manufacturing leaders on all kinds of topics surrounding Industry 4.0, which means, technologies and the combination of management approaches and the experience of trying to change your work process in manufacturing and industrial operations, you should just listen to the podcast. I'm already starting to interview a bunch of people, not just in the Boston region, but globally. You'll hear from CEOs, you'll hear from managers, factory managers, startups, small, large companies. We have a myriad of discussions, and it's all about learning how we can improve manufacturing. Jen,
Great.
do you have some questions?
Yeah, so there's one specific question about how Tulip specifically helps address these issues. I don't know if you wanted to cover that. I mean, you covered it a little bit, but maybe.
Well, maybe you want to cover it, Jen. I mean, you worked at Tulip longer.
Yeah, sure. So Tulip is a manufacturing app platform. And so we do a lot with helping kind of like grounds up building apps to help solve solutions throughout the shop floor or manufacturing facility or what have it, and how these all connect with like databases and things like that. So we really help with citizen development because like this is a platform that you can easily build on new apps or adjust the apps to fit the needs of the people closest, to adjust the needs of the people actually using the apps on the shop floor. So it's more the people that work closely with those people being able to adjust the apps and make them better rather than it being done, in IT, like far away from people actually using the app. So that's what we do a little bit for citizen development. And then also these apps, we connect to machines and other sources of data like from ERPs. So it's really providing data for the end user in the form of guided digital instructions to be able to help them kind of do their job in a very efficient way. and reduce errors and things like that. So we did mention that throughout the presentation, but that's kind of in a nutshell what Tulip does. And if you go on tulip.com or tulip.co, there's a lot of information there that can kind of help explain. Great. So another question is how it compares to Appian. So I'm not sure. I think that'll have to be, I can follow up with you after. But another set of questions that came in before was kind of what are the next steps for learning more about Tulip and these topics? So maybe Trond, you can answer that.
Yeah, I mean, I think I wanted to just actually add to your statement, Jen, to say, you know, I actually joined Tulip based on a demo that I saw, which now must be like 4 or 5 years ago. I was still at MIT. Tulip was one of many innovative startups that I had been working with as part of you know, MIT's kind of matchmaking of startups with the industry. And I must say, you know, how can Tulip help? I was so impressed by that one demo, which I now have learned is a product that only is in beta and is launching literally soon. But that should tell you a little bit. You know, it may look very simple when you go into the website and start trying to use these apps. And I have tried and started to experiment myself. And you know, it's not like Tulip is a 5 minute job. It doesn't mean, you know, whatever you're doing on the shop floor, you can just go in there and you can transform your reality in 5 minutes. That's not where we are, right? But you know, you compare Tulip or any kind of app solution to the state of the art, you know, 10 years ago when there were no solutions like that. It is night and day. But there is a little bit of an effort. You have to tinker a little bit. And you obviously, the most important thing, how can Tulip help you? You need to know why you want help. And that's the most important question, because if you start optimizing a work process, you start counting beans that don't need to be counted, right? You optimize for an efficiency that, you know, perhaps is going to create some other bottleneck further down the line. So that's of course the challenge of any tool. However simple we make it for you to make changes, you have to just make sure that you want those changes. So that would, my challenge is kind of back to you. If you have some very readily identified bottlenecks to do with, we just can't gather enough information, or we struggle with, you know, we are constantly doing analytics a week later, those are the kinds of things Tulip can help with. We can, you know, in a very quick way, either facilitated by us or ideally developed by some of your engineers and managers on the team, or even just with input from the people who are suffering and who are part of that bottleneck. That is, you know, where Tulip can help. But what Tulip cannot solve, and no one can solve, is you have to figure out what your problem is first. And if that problem is related to some sort of analytics where you think counting something, registering something real time, either through a sensor or through a very, very easy process where you just have to, you know, click a button to register that something actually has happened. And then you can immediately see patterns in the data in your own work process. If you have any kind of issues like that, that's when Tulip can help.
Sure. And then also just to build off of that, so we also have our new Tulip library. And so these are ready-made apps that you can download and start using either through your free trial, or if you are a Tulip customer, you can start using it within your account. And so some examples of apps that we have, so we have like a work instruction app. We have a new one for stopwatching, so you can stop and start and stop at your station to record things for like kind of like studies. We also have production tracking, work order tracking, just a number of apps and a lot of different applications of Tulip. So I'd recommend that as well. And that's just tulip.co/library. So you can check that out. We're very excited about that. That's new.
Yeah, no, that is super exciting. So I mean, you know, one thing that surprised me is up until really, really recently, many work processes were literally a piece of paper with kind of 20 pieces of instruction. If that's your current process, like Jen said, there's an immediate solution to that, not just sort of digitizing that piece of paper, but literally probably many of those steps can relatively easily go into kind of a Tulip setup, where some of those analytics that were part of that, maybe the first 5 steps can just be automatically registered through your software, and the worker doesn't even have to think about it anymore, and certainly doesn't have to stop what they're doing, go to a different place, log it in the system, and then wait a week for the data to show up. That is why I was so impressed with this system, because it is relatively plug and play. You have to, as I said, you have to know what you want to solve for. But once you know what to solve for, there is a plug and play element here, with so a little bit of energy invested in putting in your, what it is that you're trying to solve. You really can make a big difference.
Okay. So another question is, so when will the slides and recording be available after this? And yes, we'll be sending it out in an email. So it'll be a PDF of the slides and then also a link to the recording. And then what are the next steps for learning about this? So do you want to touch on community and then university, Trond?
What are the next steps for learning things related to these trends? I'm assuming that on trends, I can come back and have, I can have more seminars on trends. If you are referring to more, so there's many things one can learn, right? So, this was a seminar more on the abstract, sort of what does the future year look like in the crystal ball. We will have more seminars on that if you want. We'll see. I also think about the longer term. 2021 is not long term for me, so I think we will also have some work, and you'll hear about that on the podcast. Thinking about much more longer term. I'm interested in things that's going to happen in the next decade and beyond that, because manufacturing, I think, is going into a state of much more rapid change. But if you were really just asking how can Tulip help you, I think the next step is attend Citizen Developer Day and learn more there, which is going to be a massive online event, super exciting. It's going to be a big show, hopefully. We will have a summit, a Tulip summit later in the year, probably much later in the year, given this crazy pandemic. But that is going to, again, be a massive showcase of what we think industry leaders are thinking, but also if you are starting to use Tulip or you are curious about Tulip, this would be the place to be. And as Jen said, we have an online stream of things, on our own platform. And then lastly, maybe just to plug this, we are also working with the World Economic Forum on this global challenge of upskilling. So I am working, just to speak of me, with a platform called mfg.works, manufacturing.works. And we are actually challenging the world's large manufacturing players to put some of their courseware online for free. And we are hoping that we can gather an enormous amount of lessons from what, both lighthouse factories, which are kind of these extremely well-run oiled machineries around the world, but also more realistic, lessons for smaller companies. And all of that will be gathered on that platform. And this is also linked up from the Tulip website.
Awesome. Well, I think that's it for questions. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Trond, for presenting and sharing the 5 manufacturing trends to watch out for. I hope you guys can attend future events, and we'll be reaching out with the recording and future events. So thank you so much, and I hope you have a great day.